Salam alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Ramadan Kareem to everyone, and welcome to this King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies webinar on reconceptualizing the role of education in the Arab world. Just for your information, there is a simultaneous Arabic translation available, and if you would like this, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. I'm Mark Thompson, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Socioeconomics Program at King Faisal Center, and I will be your moderator for this session. Now, undoubtedly, education in the Arab world has come a long way in recent years. For example, the World Bank has noted that youth in the MENA region have achieved much higher education levels than their parents, in fact, more than any other region in the world. And the Arab world, of course, like the rest of the world, was also faced with several challenges throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. But this actually allowed for some educational changes to be fast-tracked. So, for example, increased digitization and the enhancement of educational technology or edtech platforms, a focus on skills for the workplace, and a look at the linkages between education and work. Nevertheless, many challenges persist. The World Bank's major 2019 study of education in the MENA region revealed its highly unequal outcomes, such that it has the biggest gaps in student achievements between top and bottom performers of any global region. Additionally, in 2019, that year's round of the Programme for International Student Assessment, a test which provides an international comparison of the abilities of 15-year-olds in reading, math, and science, found that 5 Arab countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, were in the bottom 1/3 amongst the 79 participating countries. Andreas Schleicher, the official who created and directs the Programme for International Student Assessment, speculates that students do not feel or might not feel that school is a place where they belong, or that teachers are particularly supportive or enthusiastic. That said, continuous efforts to enhance education are underway, although many experts say improving student learning outcomes in the Arab region must start with a focus on teaching. Others stress the importance of measurements, such as the Programme for International Student Assessment and trends in international math and science study, TIMSS, to shed light on shortcomings of existing systems. But the bottom line is that in all cases, education is seen as an essential driver for the achievement of a knowledge economy, for increased innovation, for economic diversification, and for socio-economic development. But how can this be achieved despite challenges in attainment and motivation? So to discuss these important issues today, we have 3 excellent speakers. My colleague, Dr. Hannah Al-Moabed, Research Fellow here at the King Faisal Center, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Houti, a researcher in the comparative politics of education, and Nafis Dakak, an investor in the education sector in both the MENA and world and around the world. So a warm welcome to you all, and thank you for agreeing to share your valuable insights with us today. Now, just quickly, before we start the discussion, we will be taking audience questions, and you can post these or comments at any time during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom page. And I'll attempt to get to as many of these as I possibly can. So firstly, to start us off, if I could come to you, Hannah. I know that you're currently working on a book closely related to the topic of today's webinar, entitled Principals, Pupils and Parents, Understanding the Politics of Schooling in Saudi Arabia. So I wonder if you could tell us about why you decided to work on this project, sort of your rationale, etc.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I think the motivation for this project really stemmed from essential questions that arose from my experience with theories of the sociology of education throughout my PhD research that was juxtaposed kind of against kind of the way we often approach and research education in the Arab world and in the kingdom, which is what I'm looking at specifically. So those are often very political, or they're really focused on kind of classroom practices. Of course, there are other studies, but those are kind of the two main things that I think we're pouring our research into when it comes to education research. So my education experience, beyond kind of being a student of the system within Saudi, began when I started teaching in 2006, and then it evolved into work with the government, different government entities, kind of through my private sector CSR projects, until my recent kind of current involvement, both in research and in working with Further Education Institute in Saudi. And as a practitioner, I'm constantly trying to produce or thinking about how we can produce students that can fulfill the economic development goals of the country or the region. But through the research, I developed an appreciation for the complexity of this challenge in light of how we organize our education systems and the way we discuss them. So the project, this book project, aims to really shed light on some of those areas that are often left in the dark, that could not only enhance student achievement and thus economic contributions of those who already kind of do well in school, but to look at the processes that hold some students back and hinder those goals. So therefore, I'd like to provide a deeper look into how we choose which information students are taught, who teaches them, and the way social relationships, both between students and their families, between administrators and the ministry, between administrators and the teachers, and all of those different relationships kind of influence the way that we interact with this knowledge. So before kind of handing back to you, that's kind of where my rationale is, but before handing back to you, I'd like to mention a few of the main areas that I hope to kind of really unpack in this book, as well as kind of maybe provide some food for thought and discussion for today. So I guess my first real question, and I think a really important one that we don't always think about, is what is the purpose of education? And what can our education systems actually achieve? So is it economic growth, skills for the future, the knowledge economy and all of that? Or is it more than that? You know, what happens to language? What happens to arts and culture when you're really focusing on that production of an economic actor, somebody that's going to help with economic growth, when you're not really thinking about kind of that well-rounded education that they might get if you're looking at it in a different light. Another question is, do we understand what young people need and want? And then also, do we understand who influences those aspirations? And is choice actually available to young people? Are we producing or creating a system where choice can be made and where people can envision different choices and also come back from choices that they made if they change their mind? Another question is, who's teaching? So education is not a top career destination in the region as a whole, and it's not always a priority. Therefore, teachers are often not fully engaged in the process, not to say that some are not. Some are incredibly engaged and incredible educators, but oftentimes you'll find that in many schools, you'll find a few of them are and many aren't. So instruction tends to be kind of didactic, it relies on rote memorization, and there's not enough space dedicated to critical engagement. And it's not encouraged as much as it would need to be if we really are thinking about that kind of knowledge economy transition. Another question is how we measure performance. So increasing reliance on PISA and kind of some of those stats that you mentioned, Mark, and the like is going to continue to increase that unequal access to a well-rounded education, because that kind of, it's almost an obsession with enhancing test performance to overcome deficiencies. It really contributes to a narrow definition of education success, in my opinion, and I'd really like to explore that more. And then finally, kind of classroom education, pedagogy, that tends to mirror already kind of established social and institutional structures. So what I mean by that is, if you have a really good foundation and you have exposure to different types of information, you tend to do better. You tend to then be given more attention in the classroom. And therefore, if you're not performing to standard, you can also be left behind. So if education is falling short in providing opportunities for education advancement, because we are almost kind of reproducing that economic deprivation inside the classrooms. Because the relative standing of a person at the beginning of their career trajectory is not just the outcome of their individual educational attainment, but it's also a result of kind of those structures and how credentials are awarded and how people are given marks and what types of opportunities are available to them because of their resources that they have. And then finally, last one, now that the Arab world has experienced so much online education, I wonder, how do we feel about that? And what is the role of technology in the future? So those are kind of some of the themes that I'm hoping to really tackle and shed light on throughout this project. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Hannah. Obviously, you've raised some very important questions there, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those if we can in a little bit. I'd like to bring in Dr. Ibrahim Al-Houthi now, because this relates to the question that you just raised, Hannah, about sort of who is teaching. Dr. Ibrahim, I mean, I mentioned in the introduction this sort of issue of teacher quality, and I know that you've worked extensively on this topic. So I wonder if you could sort of share with us some of your findings, some of your expertise, and some of your thoughts on this incredibly important issue.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I think that one of the main problems that we are facing now in the region, and we are still facing it until now after we launching our reforms, that still we are not providing a high quality teachers in the classroom. So if you are not getting the best of the best from your youth, from your citizens to engage and to be a teacher, if you don't focus on raising the quality of the teachers and the quality of their teaching, if you are not working to make the teaching and the teaching career as a professional more attractive for our people and more respected and increase its high status, so we are not teaching. We are not having an education system. Education system is based on teacher. If you are not having the best teacher in the classroom, I'm doubt that we could have any argument about education system and the improvement of education system. So my PhD focused more on reforming teacher policies, and I looked in depth in reforming teacher policies in 3 countries in the Gulf, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, in order to understand how they focused and why they focused to reform the education system, and to focus on teachers' policies as a one aspect of the reform. The 3 countries, expecting Kuwait, haven't done anything in improvement in raising the status. They improve the policies, they establish a new policy, however, still the quality as it is, which means that there's a problem adopting the policy, launching the reform, setting up a standard without willing implementing it and taking the charge of facing the challenge of these implementation, things will not change. Still, the majority of teachers are in low quality, not because the teachers are bad, not because the teachers are not good, not because because they were not prepared well. They were not selected well. Their motivation, their career wasn't being the aim that to be a teacher, but they forced to go teacher for several reasons. One reason, one of the arguments in the literature, that still in the region, still they are looking at this type of job as a female or a woman job. So men, they have a lot of alternative options. They can go to the defense force, they can go in other job career. However, lots of families are pushing their women, their females, their daughters to be in this type of career, whether they like it or not. And this is a problem. This is a big problem. So I couldn't believe and I couldn't understand how teacher will provide the best of himself if he's not and she is not motivated to work as a this teacher. And this is not regarding the reform. This is the culture. This is the status. This is the social understanding of this job and this career. And the second is that teachers were not involved at all in the decision-making, in the reform. I'm claiming as a state that teachers in low quality, I'm claiming that they are not doing their job. I'm setting up their new policy. I'm asking them to implement this policy. However, I haven't asked them, what do you need? What do you want? How we can improve your work? How we can improve your career? In the state, in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in the Gulf, we ask everyone in the world about our education system, but we haven't asked one time our teachers, what do you want about the education system? And we thought that what we are setting them for these teachers, they are ignorance. They don't know about education. We haven't prepared them well. You are disrespecting the teacher in that situation. Therefore, and then we are expecting that the teacher will take these reforms, will adopt this reform, will believe in this reform, and they will help us to implement this reform. I think the only one thing in order to increase the teaching system and to improve the education system and to reach our aims is to encourage the teacher. And we refocus to involve the teachers in our decision-making and make them part of this reform and this decision-making.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Yes, I mean, you raised some very important points there, and I certainly the point about teachers themselves not necessarily being asked about these things, I think is absolutely critical. And I think from my own experience of 30 years as being a teacher and university lecturer, instructor, whatever, in many different places, one of the things that I've often seen is sometimes that those people who are implementing policy or making decisions have never actually themselves been in a classroom. And that is actually that is very important. And I think sometimes, if we don't get the voices of the instructors, of the teachers, then yes, you are going to have these sort of issues. So I'm sure we'll come back to this in a minute. So finally, I'd like to bring in our last speaker, Nafis Dakak, who, and I would just like to ask you, this touching on something that Hannah mentioned just before, about the impact or the considerable impact of the pandemic on the delivery of education throughout the region and indeed the world. And as we enter this sort of post-pandemic era, what are the implications, the lessons that we can learn from the sort of the educational experience of the pandemic, shall we say, vis-a-vis, the sort of the ed tech? I know this is an area that is of particular interest to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for at the center for the invitation. And hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I've actually switched to another device to make this a bit easier. I actually want to sort of connect this to sort of Ibrahim's last point. I think no education system, the quality of an education system can never exceed the quality of its teachers. I think that's something we sort of talk about a lot and sort of seem to forget. And even as somebody that's very interested and very invested in education technology, and I do think technology is sort of one way that helped us keep the lights on sort of in education, in classrooms, etc., throughout the pandemic. But it really needs to center down on sort of the pedagogy and sort of our educational goals before anything. I think fundamentally technology is a tool. It'll help us reach our goals, assuming we've identified the problem correctly and sort of diagnosed it with the right solution. Having said that, I think the pandemic has really been sort of a double-edged sword for EdTech across MENA. In one sense, we need to recognize that this was sort of an emergency response, right? Nobody chose to go through this experience. Ministries across the Arab world, worked really hard to sort of respond. Some more successfully than others, but nobody gets full marks for this. But it's because this was sort of a once in a lifetime, hopefully, incident where overnight I'd say, schools, systems, decision makers historically in the region that were very resistant to introducing technology in the classroom realized that this is the only way we're going to salvage some learning and some education. And naturally, because of that, I'd say our systems and teachers weren't ready for this. So I think given that this was an emergency response, people did as well as they can, but we need to remember that, our experience of EdTech on learning online during the pandemic should not be representative of what it's like going forward, because what we've done is we took what used to happen face-to-face and just tried to do that online, and that's not the power of online learning. And then I'd say there are also certain age groups that we ask to learn online that probably does not make sense to make them learn online because they don't have the executive function and control to do so. Having put that caveat there, I will say, something I've been lobbying for almost 10 years now, we're finally getting investors across the region to believe that education technology, education entrepreneurs in MENA are really, really important change makers in this ecosystem, are running businesses that could be super profitable. There are a lot of companies that I can think of that raised rounds for MENA investors for the first time during the pandemic. So I'm thinking sort of A'nab in Saudi, Dr. Munira Jamjoom. I'm thinking of the Abwab team, Hamdi Tabba and his team in Jordan that do sort of K-12 learning. So in that sense, I do think the pandemic has had a positive impact. It's shown, the question is no longer, can people learn online? It's, will we invest in online learning and what are the best conditions, which we don't know, at least in the region, to have sort of people learn online at sort of a systems level. So I think in that sense, it's been incredibly valuable. It's been incredibly helpful. And obviously, I think not just in MENA, across the world, I think EdTech has had its time in the limelight.
Thank you very much for that. Hannah, I wonder if, both Ibrahim and Nafis, both talked about this issue of, it comes down to very much a sort of the quality of teachers. And I wonder, maybe a question that comes to my mind is how do you actually make teaching more attractive? What can you do to improve the quality of teaching from your experience as a teacher?
Well, it's a great question. And I think that Ibrahim really kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the participation. So I think that teachers are often handed a whole bunch of material that then they need to take and turn into some sort of engaging lesson, or at least get the students to some sort of proficiency, like a minimum threshold that they're going to pass tests, and that way you can keep your job. And that's a very boring way of thinking about what you're going to do every day. Plus, I think we have a lot of other problems that have to do with, because this kind of lower status of the teaching profession has persisted for several maybe a couple of, at least one generation, maybe two within the region. There isn't a whole lot of respect. So you're going in there, you don't really know what to do with the material. Maybe you do, but you don't. In many of the countries, you don't actually have to get a teacher qualification to teach. You just need to be specialized in the subject matter. You're going in there with the material. You don't really like the kids because they don't like you. They're not very respectful of your position, and you're not very respectful of theirs because of the way this kind of relationship is established as a negative one. So these are some of the dynamics that are happening. What am I going to do with a textbook when I don't really know what the learning outcomes are going to be? What am I going to do with some learning resources when I'm not really sure how they fit into the broader goals of what this curriculum is supposed to achieve? If there's a curriculum at all, it's usually just a series of textbooks and resources. So that's what we need to do. We need to think about how we can provide expectations that are very clear and that are co-created with the teachers and that are informed by what we actually want to achieve, I think. And then that can be taken and put into these online platforms. It can be done face-to-face. It can be done in a variety of different ways. But my experience was, when I know what the expectations and the outcomes are, then you really do a better job, and the students know that you know what you're doing as well, and you can establish some sort of relationship where you're all learning together. One of the things that I learned when I was teaching, which was an incredible opportunity and not very many people get, but because the school that I was teaching in is a trendsetter within the kingdom, so I was teaching in Bahrain Ahliya, which is also a school that I went to, I learned how to do backward design, curriculum mapping, and we all learned how to do that as teachers. Some of us embraced it, others ran away from it because it takes a lot of effort. And if you're in that profession because, as Ibrahim mentioned, it's a cultural thing, you were kind of pushed into it, you're not going to care about backwards design and thinking about your overarching standards and goals, and then develop a process to teach those skills to the students that really does focus on outcome first, process second. Because it's a lot of work. To do it well, you really have to have the passion, but then you also need the training and the resources, and learn different ways of doing it. And you need to want to do it as well. So I think we really need to create this system where teachers are going into a profession that is demanding, not a profession that is an easy second choice or third choice, or a choice that you're compromising and going into. It's a demanding profession. It's a lot of responsibility. And then you need to really invest in the way that you're teaching teachers how to deliver the information, and also invest in the information itself. But it's the how and the demanding nature of the job that needs to really come across, I think.
If you mind, Mark.
Yes, please, Ibrahim or Naz, please come in whenever you want.
Yes, the one thing that I highly recommend that we don't do in order to increase the status of teachers is to increase the salary. This wouldn't work at all. We have an examples. We have in Kuwait, we have in Qatar. They raise the salary. They provide a cadre, a special cadre for the teachers. Doesn't work. Still is not considered a high status professional in Kuwait and in Qatar. Still, Qatar is considered one of the highest salary paying for teachers. Still, they are facing a big issue with order accepting or setting up as a teacher as a high status professional in Qatar. However, if we look at our other examples, so an example for Bahrain, they came and they adopt the Singapore model, and they thought that, yeah, Singapore model, it's very good, it's very perfect. We can establish our new teacher training college based on Singaporean model. And they thought that just adopting this example, just adopting this process and setting up in Bahrain, things will be smooth. Teacher will be in high quality, teacher status will be increased. But this doesn't work. It's not easy because the way that there are still cultural boundaries and there are still issues, not in the teaching itself, however, in the public sector, in the civil service, still we are considering this teaching job, not as a profession. It's a civil service job, that's it. You need to strict. The assessment of the teachers is similar to any other civil service job, similar. And I looked at them. In Kuwait, for example, it's exactly similar. I will assess a teacher in the same criteria that I can assess a secretary whose job is to type some materials, the same standard, the same structures, because they are considered not as a professional. However, if we look how we treat our doctors, how we treat our engineers, how the process in order to be accepted to be in the medical school, it's very competitive, very hard. Only if we make our teacher college as similar, as competitive as medical school and engineering schools, in this way we can raise the status of the teachers.
Mark, if I can just comment quickly. I mean, I think, and this applies to not just education, I'd say across our region, I'd say that the first thing is there is, and then maybe other regions, but I'll talk about sort of my experience in the region. There's this lack of understanding that development is a process, not a product. Yeah. There's this belief that, the Singaporeans, the Finns, the Danes do this well. I'll buy it, I'll get consulting firm X to implement it. If I pay them more, they'll do it faster. And so that's great. So I think there's this confusion where development is a product, not a process of sort of continual engagement. I think the second thing is, and again, I think Jamiat al-Amira Noura is fantastic. I mean, I think it's great that there's, you know, a large university for women, et cetera. But I think I still remember like my first time in sort of Riyadh visiting, they're like, you know, we have the biggest university for women. And I'm like, but what? And then again, to compare, like, let's go to Dubai, you know, the highest tower, et cetera. There's this obsession with, you know, physical infrastructure because it has this really nice red ribbon moment where I can come in, I can cut the ribbon, His Excellency, His Royal Highness, whatever, they could come and, okay, this is a great photo op. The problem with training teachers is they look the same before and after. I mean, actually, maybe ideally they should look more tired after.
Yeah.
So I'd say that's the second thing is, you know, there's a lot of investment in basic infrastructure. Brahim, if you want to come in, go ahead. This is your area of expertise.
No, I agree with you totally. I agree with you. Continue.
And I think, you know, the last thing for me, and then to Ibrahim's point, and again, I mean, I would love to be able to say what he has said, because I don't have the courage, because I worry about this a lot, the whole idea of teacher pay. Because I mean, I guess my example is sort of more in Jordan, where the pay is certainly less, and there's this demand where, you know, we want to get paid more. And I'm all for paying teachers more as long as we raise the standards. But the question is, people don't want to raise the standards, and they just want to pay people. They want to increase salaries. And again, this is a complicated issue, you know, intersects with poverty, etc. But I do think we need to demand more of our teachers so that we can pay them more. That involves, like Ibrahim said, making it more competitive. That involves offering them better training. I mean, there's this great saying that obviously we have in Arabic, which is فَقَدُ الشَّيْء لَا يُعْطِيهِ. You cannot give what you do not possess, what you do not have. And unless we give our teachers the knowledge, tools, and again, this applies all over the world. I wouldn't say it's just a regional issue, but I sort of really end on sort of that note where the teaching profession in many countries, but here certainly in our region, needs to be reformed in a way that becomes competitive, highly respected, where, you know, people grow up saying, I want to be a teacher, which is a very, very rare. And I'm not sure this is sort of very hard to do. I mean, as controversial as this is, I do think a lot of things in our region fail by design. I mean, to quote a minister from an Arabic-speaking country without naming him, he said this to me once. He said, my bosses need to decide, am I here to train teachers or to combat unemployment? Because if I need to just keep employing people to become teachers, I can't hold them to a high standard. So we need to decide what we want from our ministries of education and our ministers of education. To be fair, being a minister of education in the Arab world is a suicide job. Yes, like, you can't win. You know you're going in, you're going to burn your career, and you're hoping that you create an 1% positive change, and then your career is over.
Yeah, but just one point, so not to misunderstand my point. I'm not asking, or my point wasn't about that teacher doesn't deserve a high salary. No, definitely they deserve a lot. But the problem is to deal with the situation and to deal with the issue with the rentier mentality. This is what I'm starting to use these days, that we deal with these things with the rentier mentality. Okay, we have a problem. We can solve the problem with the money. No, money doesn't solve the problem. It's not simple as it is. It's not simple as it is. It's not simple to just build one of the biggest college of education, such as now Kuwait is talking about. We have one of the biggest college of education, a new modern college. What about the quality of the outcomes of these teachers? And to be honest, if we look in depth on this situation, we will find there is a lot of vested interest in this situation when it's come to reforming the teacher training schools, because there are lots of people will be hurt, lots of things will be changed, and sometimes people doesn't accept the change as easy as this is. So because the colleges and the universities are more powerful, we don't go to them, we don't reform them, we go to the teachers because they are weak, they are will accept, they are employee, and they can do what we ask them to do because this is their job. If they refuse, we can fire them. That's it. However, to reconsidering and to reform the College of Education, I think this is a big step that rarely we do it in a good way.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you, Ibrahim. Hannah, I think there's definitely a chapter in your new book.
Oh, yeah.
about if not a whole book itself.
No, it deserves several books. There's so many different ways that you need to look at this. And, you know, again, classrooms are a microcosm of the society. And so you need to really think about interactions between the teachers and the students and the teachers and the administrators. And I always think of the idea of teachers really in our region as an HR issue. We need better HR policies. It really, so it's salaries, yes, but it's so much, it's the training, it's the professional development, it's the recruitment, it's all of that. And we do not apply that, I think, in the same way. So I think that's definitely one major kind of shift that we need to kind of make, and really to think about who is teaching the students. But then on the other side, it's like, you know, more of kind of those relationships. And then, you know, if you were the student that didn't actually respect teachers and then you end up being a teacher, like there's a feedback loop, there is a cycle, and it's generational and it's continuing to happen. Because relationships inside schools, that's another complete black box. Like what is actually happening between the teachers and their principals, their administrators, how policies are received in the school and how they're enacted, and then what that does to the end kind of target, who supposedly is the student and their experience. And I think that these are questions that we don't ask enough. So to move on from that very point then, which is what I was going to ask you, and actually you raised this question when you spoke right at the beginning, and you actually asked, do we understand what young people need or want? Yeah.
So thinking from the other perspective.
So I think that that's really similar to kind of what Ibrahim said about teachers. We're not asking teachers what they need and what they want. We're really also not engaging students in the process, because our education systems tend to be heavily kind of regulated and centralized, and the policies are set kind of with experts around the table. But I really do think we need to understand what it is that students want. So in my thesis, for instance, and doing work with young people and asking about their aspirations, and actually even asking them to compare what society expects of them, kind of as opposed to what they expect of themselves, and what their aspirations are kind of in relation to what measures of success are applied to them and what roles. And I think that really, I mean, just like most parts of the world, I think almost every part of the world, the most influential kind of force that shapes the way you develop your kind of aspirations is your parents and your family. But you need to do something inside schools to help make that a more informed decision. So you need more career guidance, and you need that to be specialized, and you need that to be directed, and you need it to be professional. Because the first step in career guidance is always self-awareness. So once you as a student are more aware of what your aspirations are, first of all, in providing career guidance in a professional way inside schools, you then do know more about what your students want, because right now we don't ask them and we don't know, but then they know more about what they want. And charting a pathway and understanding. So career guidance needs to be about the self-awareness, but then it also needs to be based on the context in which you live, in terms of what are the opportunities that are available to you? How do you find that information? Who can you go to? What are the resources? That needs to be placed together in one place for students to access it. And it needs to be done through professionals who know how to do this. And this is something that, I mean, I sound like a broken record because I'm always advocating for career guidance, but without it, we don't know about the aspirations. Students don't necessarily know about them. Teachers don't necessarily know about them. And you end up kind of just following pressures that are socially motivated and not necessarily based on what opportunities are available to you, or what strengths you have, or what you're actually kind of realistically going to be able to do in your life.
And there's, I mean, yes, absolutely. And there hasn't been very much research done on, I know we've had these conversations in private, but on the tensions between family and student expectations and aspirations. And I know I have these conversations all the time with young people that I talk to sort of almost on a daily basis. Ibrahim or Hafez, do you want to come in here? No?
It's not an area of expertise of mine, but I mean, it's, I think, something, you know, you experience on a personal level. I mean, when I went to university, I mean, I was told there were like 4 options. You either become a doctor, an engineer, and the worst case scenario, a lawyer, and then I don't know, like the worst case scenario was like an accountant or something like that. Obviously, the world is sort of much broader and much wider than that. And I mean, if you think about the numbers, right? I mean, something like 60–70% of kids that go to kindergarten today, something like 50% of kids that go to high school today are going to be in jobs in 10–15 years that we don't even know exist. So it's pretty ironic that we give them, you know, pretty clear ideas of what they want to be, how they want to be. And again, I mean, I firmly believe, you know, it's not doing what you want to do that's difficult. It's finding out what you want to do. And I really think we put our kids, and again, it's not just me now, but I think we put a lot of kids at a disadvantage. So similar to, you know, just echoing what Hannah was saying, career guidance, exposing kids to these opportunities as early on as possible, getting them to think about them, is really, really important. And I obviously think, you know, tech can play a big role in that. And there are a few startups in the region and abroad that are starting to do this at scale.
Just to quickly say that research shows that students really develop a sense of what's appropriate for them from a very early age. So around age 4 and 5, students start to think, and it's very gendered. Young women start to think about professions that they can go into, and young men start to think about professions that they go into, and those are solidified at a very young age. So this is something that we need to capture very early on in terms of broadening kind of your outlook and perspective on what's available and what's appropriate and why as well.
I think this will take us to the idea or the question that you raised in the beginning, Hannah, about what's the aim of our education? What's the purpose? I think this is one of the main things that we haven't answered. We doesn't have a clear answer. What is the purpose of our education system? And this is, I think, adding it on the teacher status, adding it all of, it's the main problem, because we don't have a clear purpose of our education system. We don't know exactly what we are looking for. So for example, if you are going on a trip, you don't have a destination, you don't have a clear destination, any road that you will so you will take it because it will give you, because you don't have a destination. So when it's come to our education system, still I do believe that when we start to reform our education system, we didn't have a clear idea what's the main purpose. Are we trying to have an education system in order to serve the labor market and the future need of the economy? Or we are providing and educating our citizens to be more modern, more civil and service, more what's called that مواطن صالح. It's the idea of having a productive and engagement citizens that can be helpful for his community. Are we educating our kids to be to love the learning, to love education? This is the problem. We are not encouraging kids. We are pushing them to go to school because they should be in the school. The question is, why do I need to be in the school? We don't have this answer yet. And we haven't opened this dialogue to answer this question. It's a very philosophical, political question. Then when we came to reform our education system, therefore we are seeking a lot of support from all around the world. Okay, let's look at what Finland have from the examples. What the purpose of Finland? Okay, let's take the purpose of Finland and put it in our education system. Then we are seeking to privatization, but Finland doesn't have a privatization. No, let's go to the United States. They have a privatization system. Let's take the privatization system of the United States and put it on Kuwait or in the Gulf. And then we have an education system that doesn't fit with each other. We have little thing from everything because we don't answer our question, what is our purpose of the education system? And if we are claiming that we are educating our citizens for our future economy, I think this is a lie, because we can't expect what the economy will look like after 10 years or 5 years. So you need to re-system and restructure the education system to serve the labor market and to serve the economic needs for a sector and a market that we can't expect how it will look like after 10 years, I think this is a suicide. The problem is, and the idea I think is we are need to prepare our kids for their future, for their career, for their needs, for their motivation. We need to provide them with the skills that they can be more in their life. The skills that doesn't matter if you are going to be a doctor or to be an engineer, because such as critical thinking is one of the major important skills that we need to educate our kids on it. However, we need to educate our kids and we need to give them the space to practice the critical thinking. There's no sense in order to teaching and educating kids to be in a critical thinking and problem solving and creativity. However, we don't give them the space to practice these skills. So I think this is very important question that we need to answer about what is the purpose of our education system.
I'd be really interested to hear what Nafith has to say to that specifically, because if you're looking at kind of entities that are looking at, kind of coming in and really targeting some of the problems, they must have some sort of, kind of conception of what it is that they're trying to achieve. And kind of from a business perspective, it might be clearer, because I think in the education space, it's very convoluted.
Yeah, and I'd say, we talk about this a lot, especially in our part of the world. It's sometimes much easier to set up, ed tech businesses that are B2C, that are direct to consumer, because usually the decision maker here is just the parent. Like, they kind of know what they want for their kid. But like I just said, that's kind of problematic in and of itself. But so if you're offering coding skills, if you're offering STEM education, etc., and you're offering it at the right price point, that becomes a lot easier. But to Brahim's point, we need to decide why we're sending kids to school. And again, obviously, this is not just something we debate in our region. At the end of the day, what is the point of education? Is it to create a certain identity? Is it to create a certain citizenry? Is it to create a certain level of allegiance? And obviously, for us in the Arab world, right, it's like wazat al-tarbiyah with ta'lim, like that whole focus on sort of moral values is sort of baked in, and sort of what kind of moral values. And I do think, for me, the biggest question always is, every single ministry of education tells you we want to teach our kids critical thinking. But I'm like, do you really want to teach critical thinking? Like, what do you think it means to teach critical thinking? And if you teach critical thinking, do you really want that genie out of the bag? I'll just, from my research, and this was a long time ago, I was sort of interviewing a math teacher at the Jubilee School in Jordan, which is a school for gifted children. And he said, what breaks my heart are the kids in my class that eventually their parents insist they want them to do the tawjih, the thanawiyya amma, the state math exam. Because I spent 10 years with these kids, teaching them to think critically, teaching them to think outside the box, teaching them that math is an art, it's not a science. It's not about sort of how you get the solutions, as long as you get the right answer in the end. And he's like, and then at the last 2 years, I tell them, forget everything I taught you, forget all that critical thinking. And now let's sit down, memorize some formulas, memorize how I want you and I need you to solve this on the exam. And that goes back to, that might work in a world where we believe people need to learn processes, not people need to be creative. But then again, I'm not sure how coherent this is, but we need to really think about, do we really want to teach things like critical thinking? Do we really want to teach things like creativity? Especially if we can't limit it, given the kind of realms, especially now that we need to decide as a society what kind of realms for expression do we want to create across multiple verticals. So that's just a question that I think we need to answer, we need to debate. Thankfully, usually as an edtech entrepreneur, you don't go down that route. You just think, okay, what will parents pay for? Is this something? And that's, in a sense, much easier to solve or less complicated.
Can I jump in? Sorry, I know that I just saw a question in the Q&A that I, kind of how are we going to prepare students for the future? And it's related to an earlier question in the Q&A, which was about, are the people that are criticizing PISA criticizing it because they're not doing well on them? And I think that those are very, very interrelated, and actually they almost answer each other. I think that PISA is, and it's related to both of kind of the points that have just been mentioned by Ibrahim and Nafith, which is, I think the idea is that PISA is going to measure very narrow skills. And if we want our students to be prepared for a future that we're not sure of, and we don't know what it's going to look like, then we have to broaden those skills. And yes, maths and science are incredibly important, but basic numeracy and literacy isn't being achieved in the way we're teaching, and we're not doing well on PISA. So we need to change the way we think about how we're teaching math and how we're teaching science, because we're not achieving it, and we're not achieving well-rounded students who are prepared for whatever eventuality might come their way. So I think it's really important to think that tests are one tool in a mixed bag of all sorts of resources that we need to use. But we really need to think about a well-rounded education. And then there's something that I really like here in the UK, which is this idea of pastoral care. But it really is about having somebody in the school that is responsible for the student well-being, that really knows about the hardship, about the challenges, about anxiety levels, mental health, and all of these things. This isn't a tag on. This is part of the system. It is the way you should be learning. So you know that you have support, but you also are understanding that support is necessary in every context that you end up in order to get somewhere. You can't just be thrown into the deep without having some sort of support. And that goes back to, again, the training, the expectations, the end goal, all of it is interrelated. And it's a difficult beast to tackle, but we do need to think about it as an incredibly multifaceted, wicked problem that we have to look at from many different angles, I think.
Yeah, because there is actually a comment and a question in the Q&A about, are there alternatives to international testing models, and, which you just sort of talked about, and I suppose, is there too much reliance on those? Are we, I don't know. I mean, Ibrahim, what do you think?
About, sorry, the question again?
In the Q&A, somebody has raised the point about alternatives to international testing models. Yeah,
I think the international testing models, it's fine, but however, we are treating it more extremely. So it's become PISA and TAMES become a target in their own. So we need to increase our rank for its own sake, and then we try to do training for our kids. It's against the way of the international assessment. The international assessment doesn't require then a training for the kids, doesn't make the international assessment as an international slogan that if we achieve more in this type of exams, we mean that we are loyal to our country. It's not competitive at this way. So the alternative is to take these international assessment as it is, as an indication. Is not the end of the life that if you are rank 15 or 20 or at the bottom. However, what is important is to take the grade and to take the rank and to work. This is why the idea of the international assessment is around every cycle, every 4 or 5 years. So you have a time to reflect before entering the new exams. So you took the assessment in 2019, for example, and then we reflect on it. We try to look where's the weakness. We try to fix these weaknesses, and we have around 4 or 5 years in order to look at it but what's happening is we are reforming the entire education system every 2 years in order to increase our rank in PISA and TAMES, which make the situation more worse. So I think the alternative is to focus on our aims and to treat these international assessment as it is, as an indication. That's it.
Nafez, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, so I'm not an expert on this, but again, from my time in the field, and to Ibrahim's point, I think there's a lack of understanding of sort of what these exams measure. So, for example, our kids across MENA do poorly on TIMS, on math in PISA exams, in both actually TIMS and PISA. And most of the response from most ministers of education is, let's add more content to the curriculum.
Yes.
Which actually then makes the kids do worse, because what the tests usually measure is sort of a deep fundamental understanding. Like, do you understand science fundamentally. Not can you do a derivative or integral, I mean, not that they go into that, but just use that as an example. Do you know what an integral measures? And without that sort of deep conceptual understanding, our kids will never do better. But for us, because the response is always this vicious cycle of kids do worse, let's add more material, let's get them, and we keep our kids at a process level. And that obviously does not engender, I'd say, the right skills, and in this case, doesn't do well on the test. But to Ibrahim's last point, we do lack, objective, local, regional measures for quality of education. I do think, for example, it would be much more relevant to compare the UAE versus Saudi versus Qatar versus Kuwait than to compare Qatar and Finland or Kuwait and Shanghai. Because culturally it's sort of very different. It's a very different makeup. But again, this goes back to sort of a philosophical, like, why are we doing this? We're doing this because it makes good headlines in a lot of cases. And saying, we are number one globally, whether that's relevant to our students or not, does have some sort of cachet and sort of some value.
Unfortunately, we are approaching the end of our time already. Hannah, do you have anything that you would like to sort of add as a sort of final comment?
Well, I responded in the Q&A, but there was a question that said, are we preparing our students to contribute to the economy? And I'm pretty sure that's kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about throughout. I think, yes, that's part of it. But I do think that when thinking about students and the education process, and the reason I'm very frustrated with some of the ways that we conceptualize it is because we are thinking about outcomes alone, and we're thinking then when they don't have the skills that we want them to have to kind of go into certain jobs that we really need now, and we're dealing with unemployment, we're going to fix it. But we're not going back to the system as a whole and the foundations and the end goals in terms of, the well-rounded, the different skills, the experiences, the culture, the language. And language is something we didn't even talk about. We'd had a pre-conversation about before. And just
we need a panel for it.
We need another panel, exactly.
Okay, I'll organize it.
All of this is establishing an idea of what education can achieve, what we would like from our education system collectively with our teachers and our students and our administrators and everybody that's involved is essential. Establishing that common goal, co-creating the material and the approach to do it is so important, and understanding that there are all sorts of different ways that we can get kind of a feedback that's not just economic. It's not just about the salary or the job that you get, but it's about yourself actualization, realization as well. So those are kind of some of the ideas that I wanted to share from that comment.
Thank you, Hannah. Ibrahim, any final thoughts?
Yes, just so about a comment in the Q&A about the limitation, the culture and political limitation, and how it's affect our education system in the Arab world. I highly agree on it. I think the problem of our education system, lots come back to the culture and the political limitation, not on the education system. In order to thrive and develop education system, our education system, I think we need to start to deal with these limitations politically, culturally, economically, socially. Then I think the education system will start to be relieved and to be developed by itself with its educators that is working so hard in the education system. However, they couldn't do more because these limitations is tightening them.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibrahim. Nafez, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly to sort of Hannah's earlier point about sort of backward design in the classroom. I think, we need to backward design in our sort of education reform efforts. Where do we want to get and how do we get there? And sort of Ibrahim's point, just address all the different obstacles along the way. And yeah, I mean, this is hard, right? Like nobody, I don't think in which they, like, nobody's saying this is easy. It's very easy to sit here and, talk about the problems. Like these are very, very hard, very difficult problems. And education reform, doesn't necessarily take the path of like, this bullet or this race car. It's usually, more of like, and I'm plagiarizing, I think, Larry Cuban here. It's more sort of a bee or a butterfly, right? Like it goes up and down until sort of it gets to such destination. And yeah, we didn't get to talk about it. And it may be sort of a bit ironic talking about it in English, but I do think the glossia in Arabic ازدواجية اللغة فصحى والعامية is an incredibly important problem to talk about, to address in sort of Arabic literacy, because it automatically, to Ibrahim's earlier point, connects to identity, culture, religion, etc. Just because Quran Kareem Muqaddas, هل اللغة العربية مقدسة, just because the Quran is sacred, which it is, it should be, does that mean Arabic language is sacred? I think that's it needs its own panel, so I'll stop there, but I think that's a very important part of education reform that I know we've all talked about, written about, but we didn't get to touch on today.
Thank you very much, Nafez, and thank you to all our speakers for joining us today and for sharing your insights on this very important topic. I've no doubt that we will be having future panels on probably some of the issues that were discussed today as well. So thank you very much. And thank you also to everybody for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you to future King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies events. And so please look out for future events like these on our social media platforms. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.